Welcome to this special episode of AU Manufacturing Conversations, which is part of our annual Australia's 50 Most Innovative Manufacturers campaign. This time around, the 50 Most Innovative has been made possible through the support of these wonderful sponsors: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. If you're interested in nominating, please see a link in the episode details. It's completely free to be a part of this campaign and always will be, and we'll be celebrating the announcement of the 50 Most Innovative list and the award winners at a special breakfast event on May 7 at Crown Melbourne during Australian Manufacturing Week. Now on with the show. Ebbe, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. It's wonderful to have you on the program.
Thanks, Brent. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries. So first question is, as always, how did you get here and what do you make?
Well, starting off as a chemical engineer with a PhD, going through several advanced manufacturing organizations in my career, some of them being new ventures with new technologies that ended up being a solution looking for a problem, whereas this is very different. I was asked to come into the organization as interim CEO in October 2023 to review the attractiveness of the technologies that have been licensed to IonDrive technologies, with a view on how attractive they are to be commercialized. So I was in an interim role for 4 months and really liked the technology and the strategic partnership agreement that we've got with the University of Adelaide that churns out this IP. And on the strength of all of that, joined permanently as CEO of IonDrive Limited. And that's what we do, is we commercialize technologies that are developed by the University of Adelaide. And our primary focus is the battery recycling technology with a new solvometallurgical process that is super exciting and very, very attractive to especially the European markets.
I'd like to know a little more, please, about the history, if you could share it, of IonDrive and how you sort of got to where you are now.
Yeah, so IonDrive Technologies was established as a spinout from the University of Adelaide with exclusive rights to any new IP that is developed by their Department of Chemical Engineering. So they have just been rated as the number 1 chemical engineering department in Australia and also number 42 in the world, led by 2 laureate professors and about 170 researchers doing research on specifically battery technology. And the holding company, which is now IonDrive Limited, used to be a mining exploration company listed on the ASX called Southern Gold, which acquired IonDrive Technologies about 18 to 24 months ago with a view on pivoting from mining exploration to battery technology commercialization. And that all was formalized in June of last year. So we've got a new ASX ticker called ION, ION. So yeah, that's who we are. We commercialize battery technologies and battery recycling technologies.
Right, and a couple of pretty basic questions just to set the scene. I always assume a limited amount of knowledge from the listener. Some know a hell of a lot, but I assume that people come in without knowing everything about the guests we're featuring. So the first of those very basic questions is, what is black mass, the substance which your technology is being applied to?
So black mass is the powdery material that is produced by recycling electric vehicle lithium-ion batteries or other lithium-ion batteries, where the batteries are collected and disseminated, and the valuable cathode and anode material is then shredded into black mass. So it's a black powder, and that contains all of those critical minerals that are so important for the manufacturing of batteries. Elements like lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and they're highly concentrated in that black mass. So recycling that black mass to recover those critical minerals is very attractive from an economic point of view, in that those critical minerals are so concentrated in the black mass that it's far cheaper than mining to produce those metals. And then secondly is, if we look at China dominating the electric vehicle and battery manufacturing industry, where they have been very, very smart at establishing an industry over the last 2 decades, and now 80% market share in producing batteries. But where they've been really smart is not only creating that capacity to produce the batteries, but also they've sewn up all the supply chains of those critical minerals that go into the batteries. So, typically cobalt that comes from Congo, nickel from Indonesia, lithium from Australia, and so on. So jurisdictions like Europe and the US, even though they've got all the aspirations to have sovereign capabilities in the energy transition, so, making electric vehicles and batteries that go into those electric vehicles, those jurisdictions don't have access to the critical minerals. So the only way that they can realize those aspirations is by retaining the black mass within their country. So those end-of-life batteries that are then shredded to get access to the critical minerals, recycle the metals, and produce their own batteries. So black mass is a very, very important commodity. Currently, more than 80% of it is shipped back to China because Europe and Australia and the US just don't have the processing capacity installed yet to exploit the critical minerals in the black mass.
So almost all of it's happening in China, but could you tell me something about the scale of black mass that's coming online globally? Is it a huge issue? Is there a shortfall of...
Brent, it's massive. If we look at the total mass of black mass on market by 2040, it's going to be 11 million tons, and that represents $100 billion of recoverable metals in the black mass.
On to what IonDrive does and its, I guess, secret sauce, if we could call it that for a minute. What is DES? What are the chemicals you're using? How do you make them? And if you could just compare it to some of the other methods of recycling black mass, that would probably be handy.
DES is Deep Eutectic Solvents. So that is a very specific combination of the ionic liquids as solvents that have unique properties in that it's got much lower melting points than the two individual solvents. The one is a proton donor and the other is a proton acceptor. It sounds very complicated, but the chemistry is very, very neat, where the combination of those solvents as a deep eutectic solvent is very, very selective in targeting a metal group that you want to extract from a mixture of metals. So your conventional processes to recover metals from black mass or mining ores is either pyrometallugy, where you just burn everything away and you're left with all the metals as a mixed alloy, and very energy intensive. You can imagine, it's burning everything away. And then the other typical process is hydrometallurgy, where you use very strong acids or bases as reagents that dissolve everything, and then your process needs to recover the metals by precipitating them out, and then you need to separate them again in downstream processes. Also energy intensive, but most importantly is using those once-off toxic acids and bases as reagents. You're also left with a huge amount of waste that also requires wastewater treatment, which is very expensive. And our process is what's been dubbed a solvometallurgical process. And all our solvents that we use are benign organic solvents. In fact, they're all biodegradable. In fact, it's worth mentioning that one of the components that go into the deep eutectic solvents is a substance called choline chloride that's actually a chicken feed. Yeah, it's an additive or a nutrient for chicken feed. So our process, being in a closed loop with these benign organic solvents, generates orders of magnitude less waste because the solvents are recovered and recycled and used over and over again. We don't have those waste streams, with once-off reagents, less energy. And that narrative in particular, having a much greener process, and by the way, it's also cheaper, 36% cheaper on CapEx and a little bit less on OpEx. That narrative of greener and cheaper really resonates with markets like Europe, for example, a country like the Netherlands, where, it's a very small country, but they have a lot of black mass that flow through their ports, like the port of Rotterdam. And it gives them the opportunity to not just ship their black mass out, but to process it locally. And as the one Dutch authority told me, this is great technology. We can put it in our backyard. And that's really the case.
You mentioned some of what makes up DES. I guess another question would be with, a reactor or whatever you're building, what goes in, what comes out? You said there was less in the way of waste produced versus the two other families of recycling methods. Tell me about that, please.
I did a talk at my daughter's school a while ago at the STEM class, and she said, "You warned me, Dad, you've really got to dumb this down so that, me and the kids can understand it." And I said, the way to understand our process as a solvometallurgical process is we've got these solvents that very selectively extract the metals that you want to recover selectively. So the first step would be like a tea bag, where if you put the tea bag in hot water, and by the way, water is a very, very good solvent, the water then extracts the tea, and then you take the tea bag and you put it in another flask containing ethanol, which is also a very good solvent. And the ethanol then leaches out the tannins. So it's just like when you're making wine in an oak vat, that red wine, the alcohol in the wine will leach out the tannins, which will give the red wine its flavor. And so we've got a process, with 4 different stages, each with different solvents that very selectively removes first the lithium, then the nickel, the cobalt, and the manganese. And the other beauty of our process is separating nickel and cobalt traditionally has been very, very difficult. The 2 elements sit right next to each other on the periodic table of elements, and they joint by the hip. And in any process, nickel and cobalt follow each other, and it's very difficult to separate. But with our Deep Eutectic Solvent technology, our formulation will very selectively dissolve the nickel and leave the cobalt in the solid substrate. And in the next stage, we target the cobalt and very selectively remove the cobalt. So that gives you an overview of what our process is. It's a series of organic solvents that remove those 4 metal components in black mass. And before our process, we've also got a pre-treatment process where we remove also very selectively what we call contaminants or unwanted materials. So, for example, about half the black mass is graphite, which comes from the anode material. So we first remove the graphite, then the aluminium, the copper, and the iron. And those being selectively removed and purified, those then become byproducts that we sell into the marketplace. So, all of that culminates into a process that has got waste that is orders of magnitude lower than a conventional hydrometallurgical process.
This is a short interlude to again thank the sponsors that are making 2025's 50 Most Innovative campaign possible. Our appreciation goes out to these legends: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. Now back to the show. And quite recently, you announced a capital raise, and one of the activities that it's supporting is the commissioning of a pilot plant, which is scheduled for sometime this year. Could you tell us a little bit, please, about that pilot plant and some of the timelines towards commercial scale recycling using your nifty little method?
So the capital raise was performed on the back of a very, very comprehensive pre-feasibility study that we performed. All of the commercialization, or our commercialization approach, is always a dual approach where we do technology development in parallel with market development. So the pre-feasibility study was looking at scaling up the technology from the laboratory that was how it was developed at the University of Adelaide. We scaled it up 1,000 times and had it independently validated by an organization called IMO in Perth. They called Independent Metallurgical Operations. They scaled it up 1,700 times. And that was really important for us to demonstrate to our investors that the technology scales and it's been independently verified. We also used an engineering company called Wood to do a process design for us of a commercial scale plant, so a 10,000 ton per annum black mass plant with our flow sheet. So the design that a comprehensive mass and energy balance, equipment sizing and so on, so that they could do a capex estimation and opex estimation. So that gave us an indication of what our equipment costs and operating costs were. And we then used a third party in Germany to do a benchmarking exercise for us. So to compare our size plant against a hydrometallurgical plant, commercial plant of the same size. And that's where we got to an understanding that we significantly cheaper on capex and also slightly cheaper on opex. So that was all the technology development work that went into the pre-feasibility study. But in parallel to that, we've also done extensive market development work in Europe, specifically because the market there is the largest market outside of China. And interestingly, Australia lags Europe by several years with the electric vehicle uptake. So that's why we're targeting Europe first and then the US second. And then by that time, Australia would have caught up with electric vehicle uptake and that black mass, volumes that merit a commercial plant in Australia. So the market development work in Europe culminated in a consortium of industry players representing that entire value chain of battery recycling. And given the circularity of that theme, it's not called a value chain, it's called a value circle. And IonDrive takes two seats at that table. One is the black mass processing to the metals, but then also PCAM, which is the precursor to active materials. And so it's been a real feather in the cap for a small Australian company to get an invitation to not only one, but two seats at the table of a pan-European approach to establish a battery recycling industry for Europe. So on the strength of all of that, the technology development and the market development work and so on, we had confidence that we sitting on an absolute winner here and did the capital raise to fund the pilot plant, which will be a continuous integrated pilot plant. So moving away from batch technology in the laboratory and the scale up also in batch to a continuous pilot plant. And that capital raise was very successful. We were oversubscribed. I think we closed on 10.5 million and selected just over 6 million at a 17% premium, which for a small cap company is almost unheard of in this market. So we were very, very pleased with the outcome of that. That fully funds all the activities, including the pilot plant, construction and build. So in January, we started with semi-continuous work, which is the initial work for that migration from batch to continuous. And that will be completed in 2 months. We're just about to complete an RFQ process for the front-end engineering design or FEED, to select an EPC contractor to perform the FEED work in the next 3 months. And that should take us to about June for starting the detailed design and procurement and construction of the pilot plant, with a timeline of having the pilot plant commissioned in December and starting operating in end of December. So that's what the timelines look like.
So the next question is your opinion on where Australia could best make a difference in the battery value chain or value circle, if you will. Is there something that's out there that you think policymakers or startups or VCs or anyone else is overlooking at the moment?
What I often see is countries, and it's certainly not limited to Australia, is countries try and reinvent the wheel instead of looking at what best practices can be adopted from elsewhere in the world. So, Europe in particular has really, when the tide went out after COVID-19 and really understood their exposure to global supply chains, and really started putting in place legislation and funding to establish sovereign capabilities for energy transition. I think there's a lot of learnings that Australia can adopt from how Europe has pivoted to that. In fact, I've been invited to 1 or 2 platforms in April and May to look at exactly that, the learnings from Europe for Australia. And I think, one of the key things is not only sensible legislation. So, for example, what Europe has done is they're planning to ban the export of black mass to China. So the black mass needs to be reprocessed or processed within the European borders. Secondly, they've introduced a really interesting concept called the battery passport. So with that, the OEMs of electric vehicles like BMW and VW and so on, they retain ownership of that electric vehicle battery until end of life. So when the battery comes to end of life, that OEM is responsible for the disposal and recycling of that battery. So that puts a lot of onus on the OEMs to make a plan with the batteries. And then thirdly is they've introduced a minimum recycled metal content in the production of new batteries, starting at 6% in 2027, ramping up to 60% by 2040. So those are all of the, kind of the legislative levers that one can introduce to really foster an industry. Secondly, is also understanding that China does subsidize its electric vehicle manufacturing and battery manufacturing. So if you want to be on a level playing field, the government needs to provide not the support in some way, shape, or form. I'm not necessarily advocating for subsidies, but there needs to be some government support to to get things on a level playing field. And then thirdly, I think where Europe and Germany in particular is very, very strong at is when they have industrial problems. They've got the Fraunhofer Institute model to address those problems, where you always have the three parties involvement, some academia, government, and industry. And then the fourth thing is, for me, most importantly, is you've got to have a long-term plan. So there was a very interesting article by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times a while ago on America versus China, and he used the example of LFP batteries. Saying that China's been developing their battery manufacturing for 20 years now. So that long-term view, granted it is central planning and that comes with its downfalls. But the history of LFP is really exciting or interesting, where it was developed by, I think, Caltech in California, and it was commercialized in America. And at that stage, the technology was kind of premature in that the market wasn't quite there to really have the technology profitable at a commercial level. China spotted the opportunity and bought the IP and is now by far the world's leading LFP battery manufacturer, which is very, very cheap electric vehicle battery technology. So that's why you see vehicles like BYD and so on that are so cheap compared with Teslas. So anyway, the point that he made is that China's got long-term planning. And if you look at America, that has frequent regime changes. So you'll have the Democrats that come in, establish manufacturing. Biden spent a lot of investments in red states, which ended up not serving him well. But you get the Democrats that start fostering manufacturing and supportive manufacturing, and then you get the Republicans that come in and withdraw all of that. And so you've got that cyclical short-term 4-year periods where you don't really establish a competitive advantage. So that's another thing that I would encourage Australia to look at, given that Australia's election cycles are even shorter at 3 years, and things change drastically from one regime to the next. So I think there needs to be a long-term view on an agreement on what is really important for infrastructure and manufacturing industry to be successful in the long term.
I was nodding in pretty vigorous agreement with your point about the Fraunhofer, and I especially like the approach to applied research, which I think I would argue, just as a personal opinion, is badly done in Australia and badly appreciated as part of R&D, as are a lot of things like market development, which people often don't consider when they talk about things like moving a technology out of university and it just magically solving a problem somehow. And the long-termism is also badly needed. There's a bipartisanship that should exist when we talk about industry policy, but Australia just doesn't do. That sort of ramble aside, one thing we're looking at through this series is the idea of what makes a company innovative, and everyone has their opinion. What's yours?
That's a really interesting question, Brent. What makes a company innovative? I worked with Professor Goran Roos many years ago, and what a delightful character. And, he advises governments and global companies on advanced manufacturing and innovation. And he's got a lovely definition of innovation. He says, invention is a solution looking for a problem, and innovation makes money. And the second thing that he taught me was when he was in Finland at VTT, which is the equivalent of the CSIRO, they had an incubator for new ventures. And the only criterion for eligibility into the incubator was you have to have a customer. So if you don't have a customer, you don't get incubated. And the lesson learned there is that if you want to be successful in technology innovation, you really need to work with your customers and understand what the customer needs are. Otherwise, you design solutions looking for a problem. And I think that's, the other thing to consider in successful innovations is the technology needs to be feasible. So the technical feasibility of it needs to be commercially viable. And the third thing is it needs to be desirable to market. So if you want to be successful in innovation, I would focus on all three things: the technical feasibility, the commercial viability, but also the desirability to the market.
When you said that innovation is something that someone pays money for, or words to that effect, I thought of the words of the founder of ResMed, who once said, innovation is when someone signs a check. And I think that's a nice succinct definition of how we should think about innovation, because all the science in the world is not the same as generating a customer who likes what you do and is willing to pay for it.
Yeah, just on that point, I think innovation is often confused with inventions or vice versa. Innovation could be two existing things that you're just combining into something new that gives you a new solution to your problem, whereas invention is something completely new and it's difficult to commercialize an invention.
I think the fancy word for that is recombinant innovation, when you kludge two things together to form a new one, like I guess perhaps a DVD VCR recorder would have been back in the day, or the first guy to think, oh, I like this phone, there should be a camera on it, or something like that perhaps. But yeah, that's not to be discounted in terms of a way to create value. Yeah, so lastly, I wanted to ask you our stock closing question, and that is, what's an issue within manufacturing that you've noticed that you think isn't getting the attention it deserves?
I'd like to circle back to that earlier point that we discussed, that long-term planning. I think it was 2017 when the automotive industry, or was it before that, when the automotive industry was phased out in Australia, and the sentiment then was manufacturing doesn't belong in Australia. And for me, that was absolute nonsense. Again, Professor Goran Roos and I looked at a project to compare Switzerland versus Australia. So pretty much the same demographics, pretty much the same GDP, pretty much the same labor costs. So you can't just throw labor costs as an excuse for manufacturing in Australia. And Switzerland's GDP is more than 20%. I think it's 22% for manufacturing. So it's not so much manufacturing that's a problem, it's what you manufacture. So granted, Switzerland is obviously central in Europe and is very close to its neighbors and so on, but very much an export focus. So if you want to make, cheap hammers and compete against China, that's never going to work. You need to identify something that has got local attractiveness, but also global attractiveness, and that you've manufactured in a way that's, high value products, advanced manufacturing with automation, but high value, so that it's globally competitive. I think that's how to look at it. And then, the other thing that we mentioned is the long-term planning. If you're serious about sovereign capabilities over the long term, you need to get all parties involved to map out a long-term plan, look at how do you make it competitive, is it subsidies, is it tax advantages, is it stimulus and R&D. Retaining the IP here is very important. Oftentimes new IP gets scouted by America and other jurisdictions and plucked up and taken abroad. So I don't think there's just one thing. I think there's multiple factors that need to be considered. But I'm very passionate about advanced manufacturing and innovation. The irony is that we have got all the intellectual capability and the IP here in Australia. We just need to use that platform to really start boosting the contribution to GDP.
Well, thanks for your thoughts on that last question, and thanks for joining us on the program. It's been a pleasure to have you here, Ebbe.
Thanks, Brent. I enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to hearing more about you.